I took the boat out from Comija's ACI Marina at 5:47 that morning, 3 waterproof cases stacked in the stern, and a claim file I'd read twice the night before. The insurer was If Skade Forsikring, Norwegian firm, good reputation, paid on time. I'd invoiced them twice in the past 2 years for similar work. This one looked straightforward. Vessel named Adriatic Surveyor, constructive total loss. Crew abandonment reported January of that year, now sitting derelict in a cove off Vis. They needed documentation before they could finalize the write-off. I'd estimated 4 hours for the job, factoring in transit time and weather. The sun hadn't cleared the ridgeline yet. The water was flat enough that I could see the reflection of my own running lights on the surface, and cold enough that my breath showed when I exhaled. I'd made the run out to Vis enough times that I didn't need to check the chart. 40 minutes at cruising speed, maybe less if the current stayed favorable. I spotted the barge from about 300 meters out. It was anchored where the claim file said it would be, eastern side of the island, sheltered cove with good holding ground. I throttled back and held off at a distance for a full minute before bringing my boat alongside, because what I was looking at did not match what I'd read. The paint wasn't weathered. That was the first thing. No chalking, no tide line oxidation, no biofouling at the waterline of the kind that accumulates on a vessel left in Adriatic water through a full winter and spring. The mooring lines were coiled with the kind of deliberate precision that requires practice, not the slack green lines of a vessel left to sit. I told myself that the abandonment date in the file might have been approximate, that bureaucratic records carried imperfections, that I'd seen worse discrepancies between paper status and physical condition. I brought my boat alongside and made fast to the rail. The deck was clean, not scrubbed, but clean in the way a working vessel stays clean when the crew is still aboard and maintaining routine. I unclipped my field recorder from my jacket pocket, checked the battery indicator, and started the documentation sequence I'd used on every marine survey job for the past 6 years. October 3rd, 06:23 hours. Vessel Adriatic Surveyor, Croatian registration, anchored approximately 2 kilometers east-southeast of Visin. Boarding for constructive total loss assessment per If Skade Forsikring. Claim reference 789421. I moved first to the galley because the galley tells you how long a vessel has been unmaintained faster than any other space aboard. Moisture gets in. Provisions degrade. Rodents find their way through gaps in the hull seams. I've documented galleys where the smell hit me before I opened the door. This one smelled like coffee and old cooking oil. I stood in the doorway for longer than I needed to, cataloging what I was looking at. Tins of food with legible labels not degraded by moisture. A sealed bag of rice that was dry when I touched it. No bloat from humidity. Olive oil in a glass bottle that had not gone rancid. I could tell from the color, pale gold and clear, not the cloudy brown it turns when it's been sitting in an unventilated space through a Mediterranean summer. The counter was wiped down. The stove elements were clean. I lifted the field recorder again. Galley appears maintained. Provisions present and unspoiled. No evidence of prolonged dereliction consistent with January abandonment date. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that these were not the remnants of a crew that had left 11 months ago. They were provisions that had been maintained or recently stocked. The crew quarters were aft, down a narrow companionway that smelled like diesel and salt. I'd been in enough abandoned vessels to know what to expect. stripped bunks, personal effects left behind or scattered, the kind of disorder that comes from a crew that either left in a hurry or never intended to come back. What I found instead were bunks that had been made, not pulled apart by a storm, not stripped in a hurried departure, but made with the kind of order that indicates either a crew that left expecting to return or a crew that never left at all. I photographed each bunk, framing the shots to include the taut blankets, the pillows still centered, the absence of any visible damage or neglect. My hands were steady. They always are when I'm working. It's only later, when I'm reviewing the images on a screen in a place that feels safe, that I notice how tight my grip was on the camera. I narrated into the recorder as I moved through the space, noting the anomalies without characterizing them. Crew quarters, 4 bunks, all made. No personal effects visible. No signs of forced entry or struggle. I didn't say no signs of abandonment, because that would have required me to commit to a conclusion I wasn't ready to commit to. The operations room was midship, accessible through a watertight door that opened without resistance when I turned the wheel. The table was clear except for a rolled chart weighted down at one corner and a clipboard with what looked like a maintenance log. I photographed the room from 3 angles, capturing the radio equipment, the mounted depth sounder, the emergency locator beacon still clipped to its bracket on the bulkhead. Everything in its place, everything functional. I moved through the rest of the vessel methodically, documenting the deck equipment, the anchor gear, the bilge pumps. Nothing aboard showed the deterioration pattern that 11 months of unmaintained Adriatic exposure produces. I told myself that Croatian bureaucratic records carry imperfections, that the insurer might have been given an incorrect abandonment date, that an explanation existed, and I simply hadn't found it yet. I came back to the operations room because that's where the ship's log would be, and the log would tell me what the physical evidence couldn't. It was on the table where I'd seen it the first time, a bound ledger with a blue cover, the kind that gets issued to commercial vessels for regulatory compliance. I set my camera down and opened it to the most recent entry. The ink was black and the handwriting was small and precise. The date at the top of the page was October 2nd. I read the log entry 3 times because I thought I'd misread the date. I hadn't. The ink was black, the handwriting was small and precise, and the date at the top of the page was October 14th. I was standing there on the 3rd. I set the log down on the table and looked at my field recorder, which had stamped that morning's documentation at 0732, October 3rd, 2024. Then I picked the log back up and read the entry again. The entry itself was unremarkable. Heading recorded at 240 degrees. Fuel consumption logged at 18 liters since the previous entry. Wind noted at Beaufort 4 from the northwest. The handwriting was steady. Not hurried, not cramped, just the ordinary script of someone filling out a form they'd filled out 100 times before. The date was the only thing wrong with it, and it was 11 days into the future. I turned back through the preceding pages, working my way toward the front of the log. The entries before the October 14th notation were consistent with a working survey vessel. Routine headings, fuel tallies, weather observations at regular intervals. Nothing erased, nothing overwritten. The format matched across all of them. Same handwriting, same ink, same abbreviations for wind direction and sea state. The final entry didn't read like a mistake someone had tacked onto a legitimate record. It read like the next entry in a sequence that hadn't stopped. I stood there with the log open in my hands and tried to construct a scenario where the date made sense. A crew member filling out entries in advance to save time later. A clerical error where someone had written the wrong month. A prank, maybe, or some kind of training exercise I didn't have the context for. None of it held. The handwriting was too consistent. The details were too specific. And the vessel I was standing on had been reported abandoned in January, 9 months before the date in front of me, and 11 days before the date that hadn't happened yet. I set the log back on the table and turned to the charts spread across the operations desk. They were standard Adriatic navigation charts, the kind issued by the Croatian Hydrographic Institute, with depth soundings and coastal features marked in blue and black. Someone had annotated them in pencil, a planned route originating from this cove. The line traced southwest by west into open water. I followed the pencil line with my finger until it terminated at a set of coordinates written in small, careful numbers in the margin. No label, no name, no notation for depth or hazard or anything else that would tell me why someone had marked it. I pulled out my own GPS unit and keyed in the coordinates. The screen took a moment to resolve, then returned to position roughly equidistant between the Croatian coast and the Italian shore, at a depth of approximately 200 meters. I scrolled through the surrounding area on the unit's map display. No reef, no shipping lane, no listed obstruction or navigational warning. Just open water at a depth consistent with the central Adriatic basin. I zoomed out, then back in, checking for anything the chart might have flagged that my GPS hadn't picked up. Nothing. The coordinates pointed to a patch of empty sea with no features worth plotting. I looked back at the chart. Beside the terminal coordinates, someone had written a number in the same pencil, 412, and beside the number, a single word I had to sound out carefully, because my Norwegian is limited to the vocabulary I need for correspondence with if skada forsikrings adjusters. Bekreftet. I knew that one. Confirmed. I stood at the chart table and stared at the annotation for longer than I should have. 412 confirmed. Confirmed what? Depth? That didn't match the GPS reading. A distance? The units didn't fit. A count of something. Cargo, crew, days. The number sat there on the chart with no context and no explanation, and the word beside it only made it worse, because confirmed implied a question someone had already answered. I picked up my field camera and photographed the chart with the annotation visible, framing the shot so the GPS coordinates and the penciled number were both legible in the same image. Then I photographed the log entry with the October 14th date. Then I capped my recorder, closed the log, and stood in the operations room with my hand on the edge of the table, not moving. I should have finished my documentation. That was the job. I should have photographed the rest of the vessel, logged the remaining discrepancies, compiled the anomalies into a report with supporting images, and submitted it to the insurer with a note that further investigation was warranted. I didn't. I picked up my 3 cases, carried them back through the galley and out onto the deck, and lowered them one by one into my boat. I didn't go back to the operations room for a second pass. I didn't check the engine room or the bilge. I cast off, started the outboard, and motored out of the cove with my hands unsteady on the tiller. What I didn't do registered as a series of small omissions that accumulated into something larger the farther I got from the barge. I didn't call the insurer from the water. I didn't radio the harbor authority to report the discrepancies. I didn't flag the vessel to the fishing boats I passed on the way back to Komija. Each omission felt like a decision I could reverse in the next minute. And then the next minute passed, and I still hadn't reversed it. And by the time I was halfway back to the marina, I understood that I'd already made the decision without formally naming it. I tied up at the Komija slip just after 1100, cut the engine, and sat there with my hands on my knees, looking at the 3 cases stacked in the stern. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I could feel its weight against my ribs. I should have called Gavin Silva at Ifskadaforsikring and told him what I'd found. That the vessel did not match the claim file. That the abandonment date was incorrect. That the log contained an entry I couldn't account for. I didn't. I sat there with the engine off and the boat rocking gently against the dock, and after a moment I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone to call Terry Barrich. I called Terry Barrich from the boat. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant he was at his desk and not out on the quay, dealing with something that required both hands. That was good. I needed him stationary and in front of a terminal. Terry, it's Raymond Shimich. Raymond. His voice had that flat register it always had. No warmth, no irritation, just acknowledgement. What do you need? I'd worked with Terry twice before. Once on a fishing trawler that had run aground off Havar. Once on a pleasure yacht someone had abandoned in Korchula after the owner's business collapsed. Both times he'd pulled the records I asked for without commentary or curiosity, which was the entire reason I was calling him now instead of someone else. I need you to confirm a record for me. The Adriatic Surveyor. Barge. Registered out of Split. Listed as abandoned in January. I heard him typing. The sound came through clearly. The mechanical click of an older keyboard, the kind the Split Harbor Authority had been using since before I started working this coast. It took him maybe 20 seconds. Abandonment reported January 17th, Terry said. No crew recovered. Vessel listed for insurance write-off under Croatian maritime casualty records. That's what we have. I was holding the phone against my ear with my shoulder, both hands resting on my knees. The boat was still rocking gently against the dock. I could feel the motion through the soles of my boots. Has anyone physically inspected it since the report? Terry paused. Not a long pause, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough that I knew the answer before he said it. No. The cove's awkward to access. No navigation hazard, and the insurance process is active, so physical inspection wasn't prioritized. Why? I should have told him then. I should have said, because the log has an entry dated 11 days from now, and the charts have coordinates annotated in Norwegian, and the vessel looks like someone walked off it this morning. I didn't. I'm documenting it for the insurer, I said. The condition doesn't match what I'd expect for 11 months. The paint's clean. The provisions are intact. The bunks are made. Made. Made, like someone left expecting to come back. Terry was quiet for a moment. I heard him typing again. Shorter this time, just a few keystrokes. Records are what they are, he said. The insurer's survey team will sort the rest. You're filing with us? I'll file tonight. Send me the file number when you do. The call ended there. I sat with the phone in my hand and looked at the 3 cases in the stern. My field recorder was clipped to my jacket pocket. I could feel its weight against my chest, the same way I could feel the weight of my phone a moment earlier. I thought about calling Gavin Silva at If Skadeforsikring. I thought about what I would say to him if I did. I didn't make the call. What I understood, sitting there with the boat rocking under me and the sun starting to angle toward afternoon, was that I had already decided what I was going to do with the number and the word. I was going to withhold them. I told myself this was because they required context I didn't yet have, that including them in a report without explanation would compromise the report's credibility, that a Norwegian word annotated beside unmarked coordinates in open water was not something I could present to an insurer without first understanding what it meant. I told myself that, and I understood even as I thought it, that this was not the actual reason. The actual reason was that I didn't want to hand them over. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was handing over. I climbed out of the boat, locked the cases in the storage locker I kept at the marina, and walked back to the flat I was renting on the north end of Komija. It took me 15 minutes. The streets were quiet. Mid-afternoon on a weekday in October, most of the tourists gone, just the locals and the fishing crews, and the handful of off-season regulars who came for the diving. I passed the bakery on Rybarska and didn't stop. I wasn't hungry. The flat was 2 rooms on the second floor of a building that faced the water. I'd rented it for the month because the work kept me on Vis longer than I'd expected, and staying in Komija was cheaper than staying in Split and motoring out every time a job came through. The landlord had left a wooden desk under the window, and that was where I set up my laptop that evening, once the light had started to go flat and gray across the harbor. I opened the photographs first, all 63 of them, transferred from my field camera to the laptop in a single batch. I sorted them by timestamp and went through them one at a time. The galley, the crew quarters, the operations room, the log with the entry dated October 14th, the charts with the penciled route and the coordinates, and the annotation I had photographed but not yet named in any file I'd written. I opened a new document and started the report. Formal tone, neutral language, the kind of thing I'd written 100 times before. I described the vessel's location. I described its condition. I described the paint, the provisions, the lines, the bunks. I described the absence of deterioration consistent with 11 months of Adriatic exposure. I included the photographs, all of them except 2, the one showing the annotated coordinates, the one showing the word bekräftet beside the number 412. When I got to the log, I stopped typing and sat there with my hands on the keyboard. I could frame the future date as a clerical error. That was the only way to include it in a professional report and still be believed. A clerical error was something an adjuster could accept. A clerical error didn't require an explanation that I didn't have. I typed the sentence carefully. Ship's log contains a recent entry with a probable clerical error in the date field, recorded as October 14th. I read it twice, then moved on. I didn't include the number. I didn't include the word. I didn't include the coordinates. The report took me an hour to finish. When I was done, I attached the photographs, entered Terry Bart's email in the recipient field, and sat there with my finger on the trackpad, the cursor hovering over the send button. I thought about adding a line. Something about the charts, something about the annotations, something that would at least gesture toward what I'd left out. I didn't. I clicked send, closed the laptop, and sat in the flat evening light with my phone in my hand. The photographs still open on the screen. I didn't look at the photographs for the first 2 days. I told myself I was busy, which was true. I had 2 overdue reports sitting in my inbox, and a fuel invoice I'd been putting off since September. But mostly, I just didn't want to see them again. On the third day, I opened them once, scrolled through the sequence, and closed the folder without lingering on any single frame. On the fourth day, Gavin Silva called. He introduced himself carefully, the way people do when they've rehearsed it. Investigator for IF Skadaforsikring, Maritime Casualty Division, calling to follow up on my submitted documentation for the Adriatic Surveyor. His voice was quiet and even, with a light Norwegian accent that made every word sound like it had been placed rather than spoken. He asked if I had time to walk through the report. I said I did. Silva worked through the contents methodically, not reading them back to me, but confirming them, item by item, against what I'd photographed: the provisions in the galley, the coiled mooring lines, the made bunks. He used the word irregularity for the first time when he reached the provisions, describing the gap between the vessel's listed status and its physical condition as a documented irregularity we're working to resolve. He used it again for the mooring lines, a second irregularity consistent with the first, and a third time for the log, though that time he let the word sit there without elaborating. When he reached the log entry in his review, he said he'd noted that I had described the future date as a probable clerical error. He didn't ask me to defend the characterization. He didn't ask me to expand on it. He just said he'd noted it, and then he paused. The pause was long enough that I started to form a response, and then he moved on before I could speak. "Did you observe any other notations in the log?" Silva said. "That seemed inconsistent with routine operation." I had my laptop open in front of me. The photographs were still on the desktop where I'd left them 4 days ago. I could see the folder icon at the edge of the screen. One click, and I'd have the chart annotation in front of me, the coordinates, the number, the Norwegian word I still couldn't explain. I could describe it to Silva right then, tell him what I'd found, and let him ask the questions I didn't have answers for. I said I did not. Another pause, shorter this time. Then he said, "Understood." He told me a physical inspection team would be dispatched to the Adriatic Surveyor. He didn't say when. He didn't say who would be on the team or what authority they'd be operating under. He asked if I would be available to provide additional documentation if the inspection team required it. I said yes, and he thanked me for my thoroughness and said he would be in touch if further questions arose. Before he ended the call, I asked him directly whether the insurer had any record of crew contact since the January abandonment report, whether any of the vessel's crew had been located or had made contact with the firm. Silva said the crew status remained unresolved and that this was one of the matters the inspection was intended to address. He offered nothing further on the subject. I heard him take a breath, the kind you take before you're about to say something else, and then he just thanked me again and hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand for a minute, looking at the call duration on the screen. 11 minutes and 43 seconds. I replayed the conversation in my head. Not the whole thing, just the pauses, the places where Silva had let silence sit between us, like he was waiting to see what I'd fill it with. The place where I'd looked at my laptop and chosen not to open the folder. I opened the photographs. I'd been looking at them every morning and every night since I left the cove, but I hadn't been looking at all of them, just the ones that showed what I'd included in the report: the galley, the bunks, the operations room with the log open on the table. I scrolled past those now, past the deck shots and the mooring line close-ups, until I reached the frame I hadn't opened since the night I filed the report. The chart table, the annotated route in pencil, the coordinates plotted southwest by west into open water, the number beside the terminal point, 412, and the word written in Norwegian beneath it. Bekreftet. Confirmed. I zoomed in on the annotation until the pencil strokes filled the screen. The handwriting was small and precise, the kind you use when you're marking something you intend to reference later. The number had been underlined once. The word hadn't. Silva had used the word irregularity 3 times in 11 minutes. He'd paused after I told him the log date was a clerical error. He'd asked if there were other notations that seemed inconsistent with routine operation, and I'd said no, and he'd said understood in a way that didn't sound like understanding at all. I thought about what his response would have been if the report had included the annotation. If I'd written it up the way I was supposed to, coordinates documented, notation photographed, context flagged as requiring further investigation, I could see the email I would have received in return. Polite, methodical, asking me to clarify what bekreftet referred to, asking whether I had any theory about the number, asking, very carefully, whether I had observed anything else aboard the vessel that I had not included in my initial documentation. And I would have had to answer those questions, or I would have had to explain why I couldn't. The call had added no explanation. What it had added was confirmation that Silva, working from my redacted report, had already identified enough irregularity to dispatch a team. He hadn't said the word team like it was routine. He'd said it like it was a response. I set the phone down on the table and picked it up again. I opened the photographs one more time, scrolled back to the chart annotation, and held the screen up in the afternoon light coming through the window of my apartment. The number and the word side by side. 412. Bekreftet. The coordinates plotted into open water at 200 meters depth, equidistant between Croatia and Italy, resolving to nothing in any published record I could find. I didn't sleep properly across those 11 days. Not the way you're supposed to. I'd close my eyes for maybe 3 hours at a time and wake up with my phone already in my hand, screen lit, the photographs open to the same image I'd been looking at before I passed out. The galley, the bunks, the log entry, the chart annotation. I cycled through them in the same order every time, like checking them again might make them resolve into something that made sense. They didn't. The future date stayed where it was, 14th of October, written in ordinary handwriting that matched every entry before it. The number stayed beside the word, 412. Bekreftet. The coordinates plotted into open water at 200 meters depth, resolving to nothing. I kept going back to the components, trying to break them down. 412 as a quantity required something to be counted. Cargo units, depth readings, personnel, elapsed days. I started with elapsed days because that felt like the kind of thing a ship's log would track. I pulled up the January abandonment report Silva had referenced and counted forward to October 14th. 270 days. Didn't match. I tried depth. The coordinates on the chart resolved to open water, and the published bathymetric data I had access to through my survey subscription put the seabed in that area somewhere between 180 and 220 meters, depending on the exact position. Close to 200, but not 412. Not even half that. I tried cargo capacity, personnel count. fuel volume in liters, distance in nautical miles from Vis to the terminal point. None of it matched. The number didn't resolve against any navigational or logistical value I could generate from the known facts, and I spent 3 nights generating every value I could think of. On the 6th day, I went back to the vessel records. I have a commercial subscription to an AIS aggregator, Automatic Identification System Data. The transponder feed every vessel over a certain tonnage is required to broadcast. Position, heading, speed, destination. It's logged and archived, and if you pay for the professional tier, you can pull historical data going back 2 years. I searched the Adriatic Surveyor by hull identification number and pulled its movement history for the 18 months before the January abandonment report. The pattern that came back was clean. Vis to Ancona. Ancona to Vis. Twice to a position in open water, with no log destination, no port call, just a position hold for 6 to 8 hours before returning to Vis. I should have stopped there. Written it down maybe, added it to a list of things to mention if Silva called again. I didn't stop. I opened the chart photograph on my phone and zoomed in until the penciled coordinates were legible. Then I opened the mapping tool on my laptop and started typing. The first coordinate from the AIS log into the latitude field, then the longitude, then enter. A blue pin dropped into open water southeast of Vis. I stared at it for maybe 3 seconds before I pulled up the photograph again and typed in the coordinates from the chart annotation. The second pin dropped 2 kilometers from the first, close enough that on the zoomed out view they overlapped. My hands were shaking enough that I had to set the phone down. The vessel had been there before, twice, in the 18 months before it was abandoned. I considered calling Silva. I picked up my phone the first time just after midnight and got as far as opening the recent calls list before I set it back down on the table. The screen stayed lit for another 10 seconds and then went dark. I sat there looking at the faint shape of my reflection in the black glass and told myself the information was publicly available. Silva's inspection team would find it if they pulled the same records I had. I picked the phone up again an hour later, unlocked it, opened Silva's contact card. My thumb was on the call button when I realized I'd have to explain how I'd known the coordinates were significant, which would mean explaining the annotation I hadn't included in my report. And I didn't have a frame for that yet. I didn't have a way to say, this is what it means, instead of this is what I found, and I don't know what it is. So I locked the screen and put the phone face down and didn't pick it up again that night. By October 10th, I'd stopped leaving the apartment except to buy food. I had work I was supposed to be doing, 2 assessments overdue, 1 in Pula and 1 in Zadar, and I wasn't doing them. I was sitting at my kitchen table refreshing the AIS feed every 2 hours, checking whether the Adriatic Surveyor had moved. It hadn't. The position marker stayed where I'd left it 10 days earlier, anchored in the cove off Vis. The heading was null. The destination field was blank. The last logged update had been October 3rd at 1,420 hours. 20 minutes after I'd motored away from the vessel and tied up at Comija Marina. On the evening of October 13th, I opened the feed one more time and stared at the stationary marker for maybe 5 minutes without moving. The date on the log entry was less than 12 hours away. I didn't know what I thought was going to happen. I didn't know if I thought anything was going to happen. But I set an alarm for 6 a.m. and left the feed open on my phone screen when I got into bed. I lay there in the dark of my apartment in Rijeka, with the faint glow of the screen lighting the ceiling, the position marker stationary in the cove, and waited for the 14th. I woke up at 5:53. Didn't need the alarm. I'd been awake on and off since 4, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator tick in the corner of the room. When the alarm finally went off at 6, I was already sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the AIS feed loaded on the screen. I typed in the hull identification number and hit search. The Adriatic surveyor was gone. Not gone as in vanished. Gone as in no longer anchored in the cove off Vis where I'd left it 10 days earlier and where it had remained, stationary, through every refresh I'd run since. The position marker was in open water now, southwest of Vis, moving. I stared at the screen for maybe 10 seconds before I understood I was holding my breath. The departure timestamp said 0400, 2 hours earlier. The heading matched the penciled course line I'd photographed on the chart table. Southwest by west, into open water. The destination field was blank. I called Terry Barich. He answered on the third ring. His voice had the flat register of someone who'd been awake for a while, but hadn't had coffee yet. I didn't apologize for the hour. I told him the Adriatic surveyor was underway in Croatian waters, and that the AIS feed showed it had departed the cove at 4 a.m. I gave him the hull identification number and the current position. I said the vessel had no registered destination and no crew manifest on file and had been listed as a derelict write-off since January 17th. Barich didn't answer immediately. I heard keys clicking on his end. He was pulling up the same feed I was looking at. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more careful. He said he could see the position data in the authorities' monitoring system and that he'd log the report and initiate coordination with the Croatian MRCC in Rijeka. I asked him if he needed anything else from me. He said no. The call ended. I sat there with the phone still in my hand and looked at the AIS marker moving across the screen in small increments. The heading was 235 degrees, southwest by west. The speed was 6 knots. I opened the photograph of the chart annotation on my phone and held it next to the laptop screen. The course line matched. The terminal coordinates were still 80 nautical miles away. I called Gavin Silva. He answered immediately, which surprised me. His voice was quiet and even, the same careful spacing between words that I'd heard on our first call. I told him the Adriatic surveyor was moving. I gave him the AIS position, the departure time, the heading, and the blank destination field. I said the vessel had been stationary in the cove for 10 days and had departed at 4 a.m. on the 14th of October, the date from the log entry. Silva asked whether I could confirm the vessel's course. I looked at the photograph on my phone screen, the number and the word, and the penciled coordinates beside them. I said the course matched a route I'd observed annotated on the vessel's charts during my survey. The route terminated at a set of unlabeled coordinates in open water between Croatia and Italy. This was the first time I'd told anyone about the annotation. I heard my own voice saying it and understood that I'd just changed what the conversation was. Silva asked me to describe the terminal coordinates. I read them from my GPS record. 43 degrees, 12 minutes north. 15 degrees, 41 minutes east. Approximately 200 meters depth. No published reef, no shipping lane, no listed hazard in any registry I checked. Open water equidistant between the two countries. Silva didn't respond immediately. The pause was longer this time, maybe 5 seconds. When he spoke again, he said he would contact the inspection team and the Flag State Authority and asked me to remain available. I asked him if the coordinates meant anything to him. He said he couldn't discuss the specifics of the investigation and ended the call. I sat there with the phone screen still lit in my hand. Silva hadn't asked me why I'd withheld the annotation from my report. He hadn't asked how long I'd known about the coordinates. He'd asked me to remain available. That was all. I called the Guardia Costiera duty line at Ancona MRSC. The duty officer was patient. He took the report in careful Italian. The moving vessel, the AIS identification, the heading, the terminal coordinates. He repeated the position back to me to confirm I'd given it correctly. He said the matter would be coordinated with the Croatian MRCC in Rijeka because the vessel was still in Croatian waters, but approaching the Italian SR zone boundary. He asked for a callback number. I gave him my mobile. He thanked me and hung up. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the laptop screen. The AIS marker was still moving. Southwest by west, 6 knots. The time was 6:37 a.m. The terminal coordinates were 76 nautical miles away. I calculated the travel time at current speed and arrived at 12 hours and 40 minutes. If the vessel maintained course and speed, it would reach the annotated position sometime after 7 p.m. I didn't close the feed. I sat at the desk and watched the position marker move across the screen in small increments, the heading steady at 235 degrees, the blank destination field unchanged. The radiator ticked in the corner. Outside, the sky over Rijeka was starting to lighten. Gray first, then pale blue at the edges. I didn't get up to make coffee. I didn't move at all. I sat there with my hands flat on the table and watched the marker crawl southwest across open water toward the coordinates I'd withheld for 11 days. I watched the marker reach the coordinates at 1917. The screen refreshed. The position held. I refreshed it manually, clicked the hull identification number, waited for the query to reload. And the Adriatic surveyor was still there. Stationary, open water, 200 meters depth. I'd calculated the travel time that morning at 12 hours and 40 minutes. The vessel had left the cove at 400. The math was exact. It had arrived where the chart said it would arrive at the speed a survey barge travels, on the date the log had written down 11 days before I read it. I set the phone on the desk beside the laptop and looked at both screens. The AIS feed on the laptop, the photograph on the phone, the marker and the annotation side by side. The number 412, the word bekreftet, the coordinates matching to within 200 meters of plotted position. The marker didn't move. I waited. The AIS update cycle runs every 2 to 10 minutes for a vessel underway. Faster if the vessel is transmitting at full rate. Slower if it's throttled down to conserve bandwidth. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen increment. 6 minutes. 8. 10. The position data refreshed twice. The marker stayed where it was. A vessel at anchor transmits. A vessel stopped under power transmits. A vessel adrift transmits until the battery dies or the system is shut down manually. The Adriatic surveyor was transmitting. It was just not moving. I looked at the photograph again. The chart annotation in pencil, the number and the word written in the same hand as the navigational notations around it. I'd been looking at it every day since I left the cove. I'd looked at it this morning before the marker started moving. I'd looked at it an hour ago when the marker was halfway to the coordinates. What I hadn't done, what I hadn't let myself do, was hold the two things together in the same thought. the annotation and the log entry, the future date and the confirmed number, a route planned to a position, and a count recorded before the position was reached. I held them together now. The log entry was dated the 14th of October. I'd read it on the 3rd. The handwriting was ordinary. The format was correct. The ink matched the entries before it. It was not a clerical error. It was not a transcription mistake. It was not someone writing the wrong month or transposing digits from a previous year's log. It was an entry written by someone who already knew what the 14th of October was going to contain. A vessel at those coordinates. Something counted. 412 of it. Confirmed. The word sat there in the photograph. Bekräftet. Norwegian for confirmed. Not planned. Not estimated. Not projected. Confirmed. Past tense. A thing already verified before the date it was going to happen. I set the phone down and looked at the laptop screen. The position marker hadn't moved. The heading field was blank. The destination field was blank. The speed read 0.0 knots. The Adriatic surveyor was sitting in open water 76 nautical miles southwest of Vis, with no stated reason and no visible destination, and it had arrived there on schedule. I thought about the vessel's condition when I boarded it, the paint that wasn't weathered, the provisions that weren't spoiled, the mooring lines coiled with the kind of precision you only get from practice, the bunks made, the galley stocked, the log current. The January abandonment report said the crew had left the vessel and not returned. What I'd seen aboard the Adriatic surveyor was a vessel that had never been abandoned. It had been kept, actively, maintained through 9 months of Adriatic weather by someone who knew what it was being kept for. The 14th of October. I looked at the date in the corner of the laptop screen. It was 1923. The 14th of October. The vessel had been placed in the cove in January and maintained there, provisions restocked, lines checked, systems kept operational, so that it could leave the cove this morning and arrive at the annotated coordinates this evening. Not because someone hoped it would, because someone had written it down in the log as something that had already happened. I didn't close the feed. I sat there with both screens in front of me and the radiator ticking in the corner and the sky outside full dark now over Rijeka. I didn't get up. I didn't make the calls I should have made. I sat there and looked at the thing I'd withheld. Not the date. I'd included the date in my report. I'd characterized it as a probable clerical error because that was the only frame under which it could be reported and still be believed. What I hadn't included was the annotation, the number and the word, the coordinates and the count. I'd told myself it was because they required context I didn't have, that including them without explanation would compromise the report's credibility, that I couldn't document something I didn't understand. What I understood now, what I'd understood for 11 days and hadn't let myself say, was that I'd withheld them because they were the one small piece of the sequence I could hold back. The vessel was going to leave the cove, whether I reported the annotation or not. It was going to reach the coordinates, whether I called Silva or Barich or the Guardia Costiera. The log had been written. The route had been planned. 412 of something had already been confirmed by someone who knew what the 14th was going to look like before the 14th arrived. I hadn't withheld the annotation to protect the report. I'd withheld it because it was the only piece of information in the entire sequence that had required my participation to be known. Everything else, the vessel, the course, the departure, the arrival, had proceeded without me. The annotation was mine. The only thing I'd found that no one else had documented. The only thing I could keep. I looked at the marker on the screen. It still hadn't moved. The timestamp read 1929. The Adriatic surveyor had been stationary at the coordinates for 12 minutes. I didn't know what 412 meant. I didn't know what was being counted. I didn't know what had been confirmed or who had confirmed it, or why the confirmation required a survey barge maintained in a cove for 9 months and sent to open water on a date written in a log 11 days before I read it. What I knew was that I was looking at it happen, right now, on my screen. A vessel sitting motionless over 200 meters of open water at the exact coordinates someone had annotated in pencil, beside the exact number someone had written in Norwegian, beside the word confirmed. I picked up my phone. Silva's number was still in the call log from this morning. I could read him the annotation. Tell him what I'd withheld. Let him make of it what an investigator from If Skadeforsikring makes of information like that. I opened the contact. My thumb was on the call button. I looked at the laptop screen. The marker was still stationary. 1931 now. 14 minutes at the coordinates. The heading field blank. The destination field blank. I put the phone down. Not because I'd made a decision, because I realized I'd already made it 11 days ago when I sent the report without the annotation, when I'd framed the date as a clerical error and kept the number and the word to myself. I told myself it was caution, professional discretion, the need for context before documentation. What it was actually was the choice to stay outside the sequence, to document what I'd seen and withhold what it meant, to be the person who'd found the vessel and photographed the log and filed the report, but not the person who'd understood what the log was describing. I'd wanted to be the observer, the one who recorded the anomaly but didn't name it, the one who could say later that I'd done my job and submitted my findings, and whatever happened after that was not my responsibility. The screen refreshed. 1934. The marker hadn't moved. I looked at the photograph on my phone. The number 412. The word bekreftet. The coordinates I'd carried out of the cove and looked at every morning and never spoken aloud to anyone. I opened my email, typed Silva's address into the TO field. The cursor blinked in the subject line. I sat there for a long time with the empty draft open in front of me. Then I closed it. I didn't close the AIS feed. I left both screens lit, the marker on the laptop, the photograph on the phone, and I stood up from the desk. My legs were stiff. I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there. The radiator was still ticking. The sky outside the window was full dark, no stars, just the orange glow of the city reflecting off low cloud cover. I walked into the kitchen and filled a glass with water from the tap, drank it standing at the sink, set the glass down. My hands were steady. I noticed that. I'd expected them to shake. I walked back to the desk and looked at the screens again. The marker was still there. Stationary. 1941 now. 24 minutes at the coordinates. The Adriatic surveyor sitting motionless over 200 meters of open water. 412 of something confirmed. Exactly where the chart had said it would be. I picked up my phone and opened the photograph one last time. Looked at the annotation until the details stopped meaning anything. Just graphite on paper, just shapes. Then I deleted it. The confirmation dialog appeared. Delete photo? Yes. No. I tapped yes. The photograph disappeared. The next image in the camera roll loaded. A picture of my coffee cup from this morning, taken by accident when I'd fumbled the phone after Bart's call. I deleted that one too. Then the next. I scrolled back through 11 days of photographs. The cove, the vessel, the mooring lines, the galley, the bunks, the operations table, the log, the chart, the annotation, and I deleted every single one. The phone asked me to confirm each deletion. I confirmed them all. When I was done, the camera roll was empty except for a picture of the Rijeka waterfront from 3 weeks ago, before any of this started. I set the phone down on the desk beside the laptop. The AIS feed was still open. The marker was still stationary. 1947. 30 minutes at the coordinates. I didn't know if deleting the photographs changed anything. The annotation still existed on the chart aboard the Adriatic Surveyor. The log still contained the entry dated the 14th. Silva's firm would send an inspection team eventually, and they'd find what I'd found, and they'd photograph what I'd photographed, and someone else would look at the number and the word and decide what they meant. But they wouldn't have gotten them from me. I sat back down at the desk. The screen refreshed. 1951. The position held. The Adriatic Surveyor was still there, motionless, doing whatever it had been sent to that position to do. I watched the marker for another hour. It didn't move. At 20:53, I closed the laptop. I didn't file an amended report. I didn't call Silva or Baric. I didn't document what I'd just watched happen. I walked into the bedroom, lay down on top of the covers with my clothes still on, and stared at the ceiling until the sky outside started to lighten, and I heard the first tram of the morning rattle past on the street below. The Adriatic Surveyor was still transmitting. I knew that without checking. Still sitting at the coordinates. Still stationary over 200 meters of open water. I'd spent 11 days looking at the annotation and telling myself I was waiting to understand it before I reported it. What I understood now was that I'd been waiting to see if I could let it go. I could.